Welcome back. Today we'll drift back to medieval England, beyond the drawbridges and stone towers, and into the harsh, crumbling reality of castle life, both as a peasant and as a lady or king. But before we begin, take a moment to comment where you're from. It's always intriguing to see who's joined us for a simple sleep story across time and misery. When we think of castles, we often imagine romantic retreats of grandeur, fortresses of nobility, wrapped in ivy and draped with banners. The kind of place where a weary traveller might expect to find a warm fire, a lavish feast, and a bed large enough to disappear in. But this image is a lie. The truth is colder, literally, because the moment one steps into a real medieval castle, not a model or a ruin sanitized by time, but a living, working stronghold of the 13th or 14th century. The first sensation isn't awe, it's cold, a kind of cold that doesn't just touch the skin, but crawls inside the bones and squats there, damp and patient. Castles were not built for coziness. They were built for survival. Their thick walls, designed to repel arrows and siege engines, also repelled heat. Fireplaces, when present at all, were laughably small, and their warmth rarely reached more than a few paces from the hearth. Smoke clung to the rafters in a reluctant swirl, and the wind found every crack between stones, slipping through like a thief with no interest in stealing anything but warmth. At night, the stone floors breathed chill into the soles of bare feet, and even the highest rooms, supposedly the safest, were subject to draughts that carried the scent of mould, old meals, and extinguished candles. Furnishings were sparse. A noble might own a bed raised off the floor, carved from oak and draped in moth-nibbled hangings. But these did little to stop the lice, because castles had fleas and rats and the unmistakable sound of something gnawing in the walls. The grand hall, where one imagines banquets and merriment, was usually a smoke-filled echo chamber of hard benches and harder bread. Walls were hung with tapestries, not for beauty, but to keep the wind out, and the floors were covered in rushes meant to soak up whatever spilled, wine, broth, spit, blood or worse. The rushes were rarely changed, only added to, forming a layer of decomposing filth, so layered with time it could have been carbon dated. Castles stank of sweat, of damp wool, of dogs, of unwashed bodies wrapped in too many layers of the same tunic, and they were loud. Echoes never died. A shout in the great hall could be heard 3 rooms away. Privacy didn't exist. Servants, guards, cousins and livestock wandered in and out of the public spaces without ceremony. Silence was a luxury afforded to no one, not even the Lord, especially not the Lord. There was a rhythm to castle life, and it was not graceful. It clanked, it creaked, it whined under the weight of responsibility and groaned under the weight of human waste. Because sanitation, that small miracle of modernity, had not yet crept into the blueprints. There were no toilets in the castle, only garderobes, essentially glorified holes in the wall that dropped straight into the moat or onto the outer rock. If you were lucky, they had a wooden seat. If you were less lucky, it was just a ledge. And woe to the servant who had to empty the chamber pots of a sleepless night. Disease travelled quickly in stone corridors. Damp encouraged mould, and rats did the rest. A cough could become a death sentence by dawn, and an infection could spread from a splinter. The walls might keep out invaders, but they couldn't keep out the pox. Yet people lived in castles, slept in them, ate in them, died in them, because as miserable as they were still safer than the world outside. This wasn't luxury, it was compromise, chiselled in limestone and held together by fear and animal fat. And if you were a guest, arriving with wide eyes and frozen toes, you might wonder, just for a moment, whether it would have been better to stay in the forest. You wake up. Mornings in a castle did not arrive softly. There were no feather beds or warm duvets, no bedside lamps or quiet alarms. Just a cold so thorough it pressed through wool and bone, and the scent of extinguished tallow and old smoke, lingering like a forgotten sin. The stone around you holds the night's chill with a miser's grip. Even the embers in the hearth have given up. If you're a servant, you rise before light ever enters the hall, crawling from under a damp blanket that smells faintly of sheep and very faintly of urine. If you're noble, you wake somewhat later, but not because you're more comfortable. Your bed is raised, yes, but the mattress is stuffed with straw, matted down by years of sweat and mites. The tapestries do not keep out the draught. They merely suggest that someone tried. The fire has burned low, and the coals offer no warmth, only the illusion of care. You breathe through your mouth to avoid the smell. It doesn't work. The air is thick with centuries of use. Castles were not fresh places. They didn't smell of lavender or lemon oil. They smelled of lard and mildew, dogs and wet wool, chamber pots not yet emptied, and food long since gone sour. Every surface is cold to the touch. The floor, hard-packed dirt or bare flagstone, is so unyielding it bruises your heels if you forget your slippers. Not that slippers help much. If they exist at all, they're leather, thin, warped and stiff from the last time they were soaked in moat water. Rats scurry between the cracks in the walls. You can hear them, soft and confident, like they own the place, and in a way they do. There is no privacy. The notion doesn't exist. Even a nobleman's chamber is not truly his own. Servants enter without knocking, carrying pitchers of freezing water, laying out a washcloth and a comb with missing teeth. Your lordship will bathe perhaps, but not today, not unless a feast is planned, or a guest is coming who matters more than the smell of one's own armpits. Hygiene is a ritual reserved for special occasions, and even then, approached with suspicion. Too much washing was thought to open the pores and invite disease. Better to let the grime seal you in. Voices echo through the halls, some in argument, some in prayer, others simply trying to locate the salt. You dress quickly, or rather, you are dressed, if you're important. A squire helps you into your garments, each one stiff with old sweat and smoke. You wear layers not for fashion, but for insulation. Linen, wool, more wool. If you're a woman, the process takes longer. Laces and pins and hair tucked beneath a veil that hasn't been laundered in weeks. A lady's beauty is often described in metaphors because literal terms are too unkind. The lice don't care about gender. They live indiscriminately in every scalp. Down below, the kitchen is already awake. A cook coughs into a pot of pottage that's been simmering since last week, its surface glistening with the ghost of a duck leg that passed through briefly yesterday. A boy with soot on his cheeks tries to coax flame from damp kindling. The smoke creeps into the hall, into the chapel, into your throat. Castles are smoky by nature. The chimneys are narrow, crude, and often more decorative than functional. The ceilings blacken over years, and the scent clings to your hair in a way perfume can never undo. You begin your day not with a sense of purpose, but with the sense that another long, cold ordeal has started. The walls are thick, but they trap more than enemies. They trap damp, noise, and the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people who are always watching but never listening. The castle is awake now. It does not welcome you. It merely endures you, and you endure it in return. You excuse yourself. Not politely, not privately, because such concepts don't truly exist here. In a medieval castle, the act of relieving oneself is less of a personal function and more of an architectural oversight wrapped in centuries of denial. You climb a narrow stair, twisting and dark, with stone steps worn, smooth and slippery from generations of similar urgency. There is no torch. You know the way by feel. The walls are damp and cold. You pass a spider web the size of a bread plate, and something moves within it. You don't look too closely. At the top of the stairs, a wooden door creaks open to reveal a small chamber, a closet really, carved into the outer wall. This is the garde-robe, from the French for guard your robe, a name that implies dignity. An order but delivers neither. It is a hole, a vertical shaft in the stone, suspended over the side of the castle wall, or worse, directly above the moat. In theory, your waist falls into the water below, where it is whisked away by the current, or consumed by whatever unfortunate creature has made the moat its home. In practice, it collects on the ledge, crusts in the crevices, and offers itself up to the wind, with a perfume that defies metaphor. You sit or hover, depending on your courage. There is no seat. The hole is smooth but not clean. There are no walls high enough to offer modesty, no curtain to draw. The narrow opening in the stone allows wind to whip through from the outside, which in winter turns the entire experience into an act of glacial bravery. Your robes blow upward, your teeth chatter. You try not to look down. Below, you can see the stained stone, the slow swirl of something brown, the occasional feather or floating rat. If you're noble, you have a private garde-robe. Congratulations. It's still a hole in the wall, but now it's your hole, and you might even have a wooden box around it to offer the illusion of furniture. If you're a servant, you use a chamber pot, a shallow bowl of humiliation, emptied only when full or when someone remembers. The smell never truly leaves the room. It becomes part of the walls, part of the fabric, part of the people. Perfume is not a luxury, it's a weapon, wielded by those who can afford to fight back. And the moat, once imagined as a picturesque defence, is in reality a soup of decay. Its surface glistens, not with moonlight, but with the oily sheen of waste. In times of siege, the moat becomes a fetid swamp, teeming with every disease known, and a few yet to be named. And worse still, your enemies know the garde-robe exists. A shaft that descends directly from the castle wall is not just a convenience, it's a vulnerability. There are stories, half true, half whispered, of spies and saboteurs entering through the very same holes meant for waste. Men who climbed in through the filth to slit a throat from beneath a chamber pot. You try not to think about that as you rise, shivering, and brush yourself off with a square of linen that will be boiled and reused. There is no soap, no flush, no gentle hum of a fan, just a gust of wind, the distant clatter of armour on stairs, and the knowledge that you'll be back here again, likely soon. The castle eats everything, and it never truly digests. You descend from the garde-robe and make your way toward the kitchens, not for a feast, not yet, but for a glimpse of food, or something like it. The castle's kitchens lie in the lower levels, where the stone walls sweat and the floor remains perpetually slick, with old broth grease and the occasional squashed mouse. There are no clean surfaces. There are tables, yes, and trestles, and long boards stained with age and blood, but nothing that resembles what we'd call hygiene. The fire burns hot in the hearth, too hot, and yet somehow never enough. Smoke billows out, curling through open doors and stairwells, settling in the lungs of everyone above. No chimney, just a hole in the roof and a prayer for wind. The pot is already bubbling. It has been bubbling since before sunrise, and possibly since before memory. Inside it, pottage, the catch-all dish of the medieval world, a stew that is more concept than recipe. Barley beans, the occasional bone, root vegetables if they're in season, cabbage if it's not. The flavour is a constant. grey, earthy, vaguely sour. The pot is not emptied, only added to. New ingredients mingle with the ghosts of last week's turnip. There is a richness to it, but not the kind that brings pleasure. More the richness of age, of mould just beginning, of something that has seen too many winters and forgotten how to taste. A cook wipes his hands on a cloth, already soaked with unnameable stains. He doesn't stop moving. No one in the kitchen does. It is a place of fire, noise and panic. A dog barks. A scullion cries over a dropped bowl. Somewhere, a goose honks in protest, though it is unclear whether it is still alive. The bread is nearly done baking, which means it is nearly hard enough to be legally classified as a blunt object. Flat, dense and darker than most forest floors, it will be served with every meal, dipped into the pottage like a sponge that has lost its will to live. As a noble, your food is seasoned, slightly. A pinch of pepper, a dash of something imported and expensive, ground by hand with a mortar and pestle by someone who will never taste it. But spice is rare, and most of it has long since lost its potency. If you're lucky, the meat is fresh. If you're honest, it isn't. Meat is salted, smoked, or hung until it twitches. Rats pick at it in the night. Mould is cut away with confidence, and the rest is declared edible by tradition, not inspection. The castle kitchen is not a place of joy. It is a place of heat and anxiety. No recipes, only memory. No sanitation, only repetition. No laughter, only instructions, shouted over the crackle of fat and the hiss of spilled wine. The floor is always wet. The air always damp. Your clothes stick to your back by midday and stay that way until night. And yet this is the heart of the castle, the one room that produces sustenance, or at least enough calories to continue existing. There is no choice. You eat what you're given. You thank the cook. You chew quickly. You try not to wonder what that crunch was. You drink weak ale to dull the taste and the memories. And then you get back to work, because dinner won't cook itself, and neither will the next 10 years. And if the rats don't get into the stores again, if the bread doesn't mould too quickly, and if the Lord doesn't request roast swan again, then you might just make it through the week, or not. The kitchen, like the castle, does not care. It feeds, it fumes, it burns, it waits. You leave the kitchen with your stomach heavy and your tongue still coated in the persistent flavour of overcooked barley and boiled something. The warmth of the hearth fades behind you as you climb the stairs toward the inner keep. The castle doesn't welcome you back. It envelops. The air grows colder with every step, more stale, more solemn. The walls are thick, built to withstand siege engines and the bitter gossip of neighbouring lords. They are not built for comfort. They loom, they press inward, they listen. In the great hall, the banners hang limp, weighed down by soot and time. They depict heroic deeds that likely never happened. Boars slain by candlelight, dragons pierced by golden spears, ancestors with improbably clean tunics and smug eyes. The reality of those ancestors is much closer to what you see now. Men with stooped backs and bad tempers. Women with calloused hands and eyes red from smoke. The hearth in the centre crackles, but weakly. The wood is damp again. It always is. Above, the ceiling beams creak in the wind, and something, a bird or a bat or something that used to be a bird, scratches behind the rafters. Around the long table, wooden benches wait. They are hard, always. There are no cushions, unless you bring one yourself, and even then, it will be stolen or soiled by week's end. The table is scarred with knife marks and dried stains, each one a story, or at least a mistake. Meals here are loud, Not joyful loud, just echoing, clattering, sharp. Trenches of stale bread thump down beside cups of thin ale. The Lord sits higher, on a dais, but even his chair is a splintered throne of discomfort. Rank may shield you from hunger, but not from splinters. Conversation is performative, jokes are dangerous. Laughter, unless issued by the Lord, is usually followed by silence. And glances, you speak carefully. You smile when required. You nod more than you agree. Because every word spoken in this hall is remembered. Not by stone or by gods, but by people. Stewards, squires, wives, children. People who will use your phrasing against you in a month, a season, a year. The castle keeps no secrets. Its walls are porous to rumour, and the cold carries sound like a thread through a loom. One whisper from the kitchens can reach the chambers above. A complaint muttered at the hearth finds its way to the Lord's ears before the morning meal. And once spoken, a thought is never truly gone. It lingers, it bruises. You notice the draught again. It snakes along the floor, curling around your ankles like a suspicious cat. Someone has propped open the outer door, likely to let out the smoke. But instead, it lets in the November air. The servants scurry to close it. Too late. The temperature drops another degree. Somewhere, a goblet freezes to a tabletop. Somewhere else, a rat chews through a grain sack with newfound energy. At night, this hall becomes a different kind of space. The torches are few, the shadows deep. Sound echoes louder in the dark. The fire snaps like breaking bones. And if you lie awake in one of the rooms above, staring at a ceiling you can't quite see, you'll hear the castle settling, breathing almost. A whisper of stone grinding on stone, a sigh through the arrow slits, a footstep you hope was only yours. You pull the covers tighter, scratch at a flea, and wait for the bell to ring in the next morning. Because in a castle, you are never alone, not truly. The walls are always watching, and they remember everything. Now let us imagine, for a moment, that you are not a servant, not a cook, not a chambermaid, huddled in itchy wool by a dying fire. You are a lord, a lady, perhaps even the king. Surely now the stone feels softer beneath your feet. Surely now the cold has been banished, and the pottage replaced with something golden, steaming, and properly seasoned. But the truth, as always, wears a different robe. Being at the top of the feudal ladder does not lift you from the muck. It simply places your misery in better lighting. The draught still finds you, even in the solar. Your chamber is larger, yes, and perhaps it boasts a second hearth, but the warmth remains reluctant. The tapestries are finer, more colourful, but no less dusty. And the bed, for all its carvings and embroidered linens, still hosts lice. They are democratic creatures, after all. Your garments are heavier now, not merely in weight, but in expectation. Every thread represents a tax paid, a levy enforced, a favour called in. Silk itches in a different way than wool. The crown, if you wear one, presses down with theatrical gravity. It is not made for comfort, it is made to be seen, to remind everyone, yourself included, that your head is no longer your own. You dine alone, but never in silence. Every bite is watched, every word is weighed. You are not allowed to be tired. You are not permitted to be confused. A noble must always appear certain, even when all certainty has fled. Especially then, your food is, technically, better. There is meat on your plate, and it has been spiced, not generously, but enough to signal wealth. A leg of goose, perhaps, or a joint of beef so tough it must be soaked in wine for days to become edible. Wine, yes, not water, never water. Even you are not immune to the moat's microbial vengeance. You drink wine for hydration, wine for ceremony, wine to forget. And yet the wine does not dull the constant ache behind your eyes. The one born from petitions, disputes, and the daily performance of supremacy. There are guests to entertain, always guests, minor nobles with long grievances and longer stories, bishops with oily smiles, foreign emissaries with eyes like traps. You must be polite, you must be commanding. You must remember which cousin married which baroness's sister, and which insult from 3 winters ago still lingers like mould in the corners of a chapel. You must be endlessly gracious and permanently alert. To be noble is to live in a stage play without intermission. Your wife or husband is not your choice. That decision was made long ago, by people whose names you only remember out of political necessity. You share a bed, perhaps. More often, you do not. Children arrive on schedule, not because of love, but because of duty. They are not raised, they are sculpted. Each one a diplomatic tool, sharpened and polished, sent to convent or court like a parcel. Their smiles are rehearsed, their futures not their own. And when the castle is quiet, truly quiet, in those rare moments when the fires burn low and the courtiers sleep, you are left alone with yourself. And this, perhaps, is the cruelest burden of all, because the lord cannot confess uncertainty, the lady cannot weep without risk, the king cannot tremble, and yet under the heavy furs, with your hands still stained from sealing wax, you do. Because no amount of title or land or velvet can change the fact that the wind still howls through the cracks, and that somewhere deep in the walls, a rat is chewing its way toward your pantry. Your morning begins not with stillness, but with voices. Not whispered prayers or birdsong, but complaints, entreaties, demands. A steward at the door, with parchment in hand. A squire reporting on the stables. A priest requesting your opinion on heresy, or at least a generous donation. You nod, you blink, you agree, you defer. Decisions must be made before your porridge is even cooled. And all of them matter, or at least they pretend to. This is the paradox of power, to be burdened with everything and trusted with nothing. Every hour is filled with choices, and none are entirely yours. You rule, yes, but only within the narrow lines carved by custom, expectation, and the memory of your predecessors' failures. A man arrives from the next village over, hat clutched in hands that are too clean to trust. He speaks of a boundary dispute. Someone's sheep wandered, someone's wife wept, someone's fence was mysteriously trampled by night. You're expected to listen, not deeply, not with the curiosity of a friend, but with the solemn nod of a figure carved from wood. They watch your face for signs, flickers of empathy, flickers of annoyance, flickers of memory. Because each decision you make echoes. It echoes through the valley, through the fields, through generations, and it always, always returns. Your advisors, if you can call them that, do not help. They offer opinions, not solutions. Each one calculated, laced with subtle favours, ode or insults not yet forgotten. You hear 10 sentences before breakfast and forget 9 of them by supper, but the one you remember will be the one that stings. Everyone around you is playing a game, and the rules shift daily. There is no privacy, not truly. Your letters are opened by trembling scribes who pretend not to read. Your expressions are studied at dinner. Your hesitations are discussed in back corridors by people who smile too often. If you take too long to answer a question, the silence itself becomes an answer. There is no, I don't know. There is only, let me consider. Consider quickly, or they will assume weakness. And weakness is a currency that spends itself rapidly. You pace, The solar is colder than you remember. The stone beneath your slippers bites through the velvet. A fire has been lit, but too late. Your breath still mists. Outside, the sound of hooves. A messenger, perhaps, or a rival, or someone bearing plague. You wait for the knock. It comes, always too soon. You are not allowed to disappear, not even for a day. If you fall ill, someone will inherit. If you disappear, someone will rejoice, so you perform. Each sentence weighed, each nod curated. You are not yourself. You are the office you hold, and even that is temporary. By the time you reach the chapel for the evening's prayer, your knees ache, not from kneeling, but from the slow erosion of hours. The priest mumbles a verse. You mouth the words. You pretend they comfort you. The candle sputters. The scent of incense is too strong. Your stomach grumbles, and someone hears it. Everything you are is observed. And when the chapel doors close and the bells fall silent, you do not rest. You return to your chamber, where another scroll waits, another decision, another list of names, another night of being watched, even in sleep, by your ancestors, your portraits, your walls. You are not alone. You are never alone. Power, it turns out, is just another kind of surveillance, and the castle has never once blinked. When evening comes and the bells toll for supper, you descend to the great hall in attire that weighs more than a child and breathes less than a tomb. Velvet trimmed with fur, silk lined with expectations. The fire has been stoked to impressive height, more for display than warmth, and its smoke drifts toward the rafters with the slow reluctance of a prayer denied. Servants rush about in practiced choreography, placing trenchers, filling cups, arranging dishes that must impress without alarming, satisfy without exceeding the harvest's reality. You sit at the high table, beneath a tapestry that depicts your grandfather's most convenient victory. You smile as if it's true. A feast is not a meal. It is a performance in 5 acts, each one marked by a different kind of exhaustion. The first course arrives, a procession of meats too tough to chew and sauces too elaborate to identify. There are pigeons, roasted and arranged to resemble something more expensive. There is a fish, boiled to rubber, and served with a paste of herbs, designed to mask the fact that it turned 3 days ago. Bread is ever present. Flat, dark, hard enough to qualify as weaponry. The wine flows, though never enough to forget where you are. Too much wine and your words will slur, your hand will tremble, and someone will notice. Someone always notices. You must eat slowly, not out of pleasure, but precision. Your bites are signals. Your gestures read like scripture. A nod at the roasted boar is a blessing to the cook. A pause before the pottage might be interpreted as insult. You must compliment, not sincerely. Sincerity is far too dangerous, but strategically. The steward who procured the venison needs reassurance. The lady beside you needs distraction from her husband's leering gaze. The guest across the table, some baron from a swampy march, needs to believe he matters. For the sake of the borders, you let him. Musicians play badly, a lute out of tune, a pipe that whistles more than it sings, but they are loud enough to cover whispers, and that is their purpose. Behind you in the shadows, servants slip between pillars, carrying platters and secrets. You hear your name once, just once, not shouted, not addressed, just spoken, the syllables sharp, clipped somewhere near the gallery. You pretend not to hear. It is safer that way. Your fingers cramp from holding the goblet. Your cheeks ache from smiling. The food is cold before you finish, but no one notices. They are watching you too closely. A lord must appear content. A lady must glow. The king must shine, even when his shoes are filled with sweat and his heart is churning like the moat. You are not allowed to be tired. You are not allowed to leave early, not unless you wish for rumours to bloom like mould on a pear. So you stay. You endure. When the last course comes, some regrettable paste of nuts and honey, you eat it even if your stomach protests. Sweetness is a signal that the evening is ending. Not joy, just conclusion. You nod once more. You rise. Everyone watches. You exit the hall not as yourself, but as the mask you wear. Your footsteps echo. Your shadow flickers. Behind you, the hall erupts in chatter. They dissect every glance, every pause, every crumb left on your plate. The feast is over. The performance lingers. You return to your chamber. You peel off the garments that felt like armour. And beneath it all, you are still cold. The castle has not grown warmer, only louder. You retire for the night, or what passes for night, in a place that never truly sleeps. The corridors dim, torches sputter, and the quiet that settles over the castle is not one of peace, but of withheld breath. Your chamber waits, but it does not welcome. The air is still, heavy with the breath of 100 previous nights. You cross the threshold and feel the temperature drop. No fire yet. A servant hurries to light one, eyes low, movements quick but cautious. The hearth cracks reluctantly, as though protesting its own uselessness. You pretend not to notice the smoke curling inward. The bed is large, high and wooden, a frame meant to intimidate rather than comfort. Curtains hang from it like shrouds, meant to block the draught, but they only trap the smell of old wool and sweat. The mattress is straw, more even than most, but not soft. It shifts when you do, groans when you breathe. The linens were changed last month. That counts as a luxury. You try not to think about the mites. You try harder not to think about the chill that seeps through even your fur-lined robe. You undress quickly, shivering, and step into garments meant for sleep, only marginally lighter than what you wore to dinner. The chamber should be quiet, but it never is. The wind moans through the arrow slits. Somewhere in the walls, a squirrel has died or a rat has given birth. It's impossible to tell which from the sound. A beam creaks above, and the fire crackles, sending sparks up the chimney in a suicidal burst of warmth. You settle into the bed, sinking not into softness, but into a sense of reluctant submission. The day is over. Your body aches, your temples throb, and yet sleep does not come easily. Not here. There is no privacy in the chamber, only a temporary illusion of it. The door does not lock, not in any meaningful way. A steward may enter at dawn or earlier if a message arrives. A maid may slip in to check the embers or retrieve forgotten linens. You might wake to the sound of voices just beyond the curtain. You might never fully sleep. This is not a sanctuary. It is a stage between acts. A place to close your eyes, not to dream, but to recover just enough to perform again. Your spouse, if they share the bed, does not speak. You face opposite walls. The distance between your shoulders is filled with politics. Children have rooms of their own, or nurses who answer their cries. You do not. You're expected to rest without interruption, but rest is not rest. When it is enforced, you lie still, you breathe shallowly. You wait for the cold to dull your thoughts. The fire dies quicker than it should. The chamber dims again. The silence becomes thicker, almost wet. You close your eyes against the dark, against the ceiling's oppressive weight, against the knowledge that somewhere in the castle a message is being written. Your name may be on it. Your decisions may already be discussed. Sleep comes, but it is not kind. It arrives like fog, clinging, uneasy, and too brief. And when the bell tolls for morning prayers, you will rise again, because there is no rest for the powerful, only pauses. And the chamber is never truly yours. It belongs to the castle. As you do, you dream badly, not of triumph, not of peace, and certainly not of comfort. Your sleep is thin, transparent, brittle, something laid over your thoughts like a veil that never quite descends. You do not fall into sleep so much as pass sideways into it, pulled by obligation rather than fatigue. Even rest now is a performance. The fire has gone out, again. The chamber is grey, not with light, but with the memory of it. Somewhere beyond the curtain a servant coughs. Somewhere deeper still, in the marrow of the stone, the castle dreams with you. Its walls hold every sound, its silence is full of teeth. The dream begins like many do. You are standing in your hall, but something is wrong. The proportions are off. The walls stretch too high. The tapestries ripple. There is no wind, and the table runs the length of the chamber, impossibly long. You walk beside it. It goes on forever. Your feet echo on bare stone, though you're sure the rushes were changed yesterday. There are no voices, but you feel watched. You always feel watched. The chairs are full, shadowed figures hunched around empty trenchers. They do not speak. They do not move. But their presence is heavy, a gravity of judgment. You reach the high seat, and your goblet is already there, filled. You lift it, sip, and the wine tastes of ash. You try to speak. Nothing emerges, not a whisper, not a breath. You sit and the table tilts, just slightly, enough to let everything begin to slide. Plates first, then goblets, then hands. You hear a knife fall somewhere below. The dream does not let you stand. You grip the arms of your chair and feel them pulse. The wood is warm. It beats like a heart. You wake, but not entirely. The chamber is dark, your mouth dry, the blanket half kicked off. You breathe and listen and know it will begin again. The crown sleeps lightly, and the dream is not done with you. Sleep returns, but not gently. It drags, it coils, it leads you back not to comfort, but to the same place disguised in different colours. The hall again. But now it is flooded, not with water, not quite, with ink perhaps. A dark, glistening sheen spreads across the floor, slow and steady, reflecting torchlight that flickers without flame. The figures at the table remain, though now their faces are visible. You know them. Some are alive, some are not. A steward who died 3 winters ago. A cousin who fell from a horse. Your mother, staring as she did in her last days. Lips tight, eyes wet with unspoken things. No one speaks. They eat nothing. They simply look. You cannot remember what you've done wrong, only that you must have. The ink laps at your boots. You try to stand, but your legs are heavy. Not bound, just full, as if the blood has pooled downward and forgotten how to rise. The high table is empty now. You do not remember rising. You do not remember walking here, but you are standing before it, and there is another figure in your seat. They wear your robe, your ring, your face almost, but not your eyes. The eyes are older, colder. You reach forward, the figure reaches back. You both hesitate. The castle groans, not in dream, in real. The stone shifts with temperature, or memory. There is no difference anymore. You wake again. You do not gasp. You simply open your eyes into the familiar dark. The curtain breathes. The fire is ash. Your body remembers the dream, even as your mind begins to release it. You lie there, still, blanketed in sweat and silence. And after a while, the cold does what it always does. It pushes you back down, back under, and the dream waits. Patient, always patient. This time you are not in the hall. The dream has moved on, as dreams do, casually, cruelly, without announcement. You're outside the castle now, though you don't remember walking. The air is thick with fog, and your breath forms no cloud. You walk barefoot across ground that yields, not like earth, but like pages. Parchment laid end to end, soft, crinkling, endless. Each step smudges something. Words, ledgers, names. You feel a kind of loss beneath your feet, but you don't stop. You keep moving, though there is no path and no sense that movement matters. The castle looms ahead, not the real one. This one is taller, darker, more like memory than architecture. Its towers vanish into the cloud line. Its walls glisten with moisture that isn't rain. You approach the gate and find it open, not swinging, not ajar, but simply absent, like someone forgot to build it. You walk through. Inside, it is silent. Not quiet, silent. A kind of silence that pushes against your eardrums and makes your bones feel hollow. The tapestries are gone. The floor is dry, too dry, like it's been waiting for you. You find the throne room, though it is not where it should be. The room bends in the wrong direction. The throne is not stone. It is made of mirrors, or something that tries to be mirrors. You see yourself in it, but the reflection wavers, splinters, multiplies. There are too many of you, each one holding a crown, each one wearing it slightly differently, tilted, broken, too tight. One of them has no head. Another is laughing without sound. You approach. You reach out. You place the crown on your head. It is weightless. And that somehow is worse. Because in this dream, it doesn't press, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't burn or chafe or crush your skull like it does in waking. It floats above you, a symbol only. And you realise, too late, that it has never truly touched you at all, that everything you thought was heavy was merely performance. The real burden, the unbearable one, was never the crown. It was what it meant to pretend it mattered. You wake with your jaw clenched and your arms tangled in the blanket. The fire has died entirely. Your teeth chatter once before you stop them. The sky outside is still black but lighter now. Morning waits just beyond the slit in the stone. And the dream, whatever it was, is already receding. But its chill remains. It always does. The light comes slowly, like something ashamed of itself. Not golden, not warm, but pale and reluctant, filtered through a slit in the wall that offers no view, only a suggestion that something still exists beyond the stone. You open your eyes and stare upward, but the ceiling gives you nothing. Just the same beams, the same blackened wood, the same faint scratchings from whatever lives above. The dream is gone. Or mostly gone. It left its shape behind, like a warm body departing a cold bed. You remember the weightless crown. You remember the silence. You remember walking on names. And then nothing. Only the ache in your neck and the way the blanket has twisted itself into a noose around your legs. The castle is already awake. You hear it, through the walls, the floor, the thin air between thoughts. A door opens, hinges sighing like tired lungs. Someone drops a pail, someone swears. A dog barks twice, pauses, then barks again with the rhythm of routine. Downstairs the scullions are lighting fires, coughing into the smoke. Water sloshes, iron clatters, boots on stairs. A rooster, confused by torchlight, begins too early and doesn't stop. You lie still, for a moment, for as long as you dare. Then, without decision, your body begins the ancient, involuntary act of rising, one leg free of the blanket, one foot on the cold stone. You wince, not from pain, but from recognition. It is this again, this day, the same shape, slightly more worn, slightly more fragile. You sit on the edge of the bed and feel the chill of the room crawl up your spine with familiar fingers. A servant enters, head bowed, carrying garments stiff from the cold and folded with meaningless precision. You nod. You do not thank them. You never do. It would only confuse the order of things. You dress without speaking. The robe goes over the shift, the outer coat over the robe, fur-lined boots, too narrow. A belt you never adjusted, a ring you don't remember choosing. Each layer a kind of armour, not against battle, but against memory, against doubt, against the part of yourself that still stands in a mirrored throne room, wondering whether any of this is real. Outside your door, the corridor is quiet. Not truly, but the kind of quiet that castles wear when they are pretending to be asleep. The kind of quiet that masks intention. You move through it, down the stairs, past the chapel where someone has already begun the morning prayers. The Latin chants echo with no audience, just words spilling into the vaults, to be absorbed by stone and forgotten. You do not speak until you reach the hall. You do not smile. You do not hesitate. You take your seat at the head of the table and wait for food you will not enjoy and conversations you will not remember. And when someone asks if you slept well, you lie. The food arrives, though calling it that is generous. It is warm, technically, though only in the way that stones left near a dying fire are warm. A trencher is set before you, flatbread hardened into a plate, filled with pottage reheated from last night's pot, or perhaps from last week's. A slab of salt pork rests atop it, glistening faintly with rendered fat, stiff from age and effort. A knife is placed at your side, more ceremonial than sharp. You grip it and begin the daily act of pretending this is nourishment. Across the table sit lesser nobles, guests, family members, bound by title and tension. They chew and murmur, their words rising in steam above their bowls. Conversation is not about ideas. It is about appearances. How long the journey took, how bitter the wind was, how one steward offended another. You nod where expected. You sip your ale. It is thin, sour, and better than the water, barely. A servant offers wine. You decline. It is too early, even for performance, or perhaps too late. A young cousin speaks about a recent fox hunt. His tunic is new, his fingers uncalloused. He speaks loudly, and no one stops him. This is how legacy begins, with unearned confidence and unpunished stories. You let him talk. You remember his father, and how he bled from the mouth for 2 days after a dinner just like this. You chew slowly, not out of hunger, but because it delays speech. Every word from your mouth must be weighed, not for truth, but for its future. A careless phrase can echo longer than a cathedral bell. You learned that once, in a hall much like this one, when you asked a simple question, and 3 servants were whipped before nightfall. The lord to your left comments on your robe. You nod. It is new or new to you. You did not choose it. The merchant who delivered it is dead now. Fever or a knife or both. The robe remains, much like the table, much like you. You reach for the bread. It resists, then breaks. Crumbs fall like ash across your lap. You brush them away. You try to forget the dream, the weightless crown, the mirrored throne. You fail. The meal ends not with fullness, but with formality. A short prayer, a longer silence. Dishes are cleared with bowed heads and blank eyes. You stand, the others rise. The cousin says something meant to amuse. You smile, it hurts. You exit the hall. The fire behind you crackles once, spitting sap like a whisper. And then the day begins, with a full belly, a hollow heart, and the sound of footsteps that are not your own, echoing ahead of you through corridors built, not for comfort, but for command. You do not make it to the solar before the first petition arrives. A steward with ink-stained fingers intercepts you at the stairs, clutching a scroll so tightly that the wax seal has cracked. He bows too deeply and begins to explain a land dispute in the southern quarter of your estate, something about a fence, a goat, and a claim that dates back to a wedding no one can prove happened. You nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that you are, once again, the place where indecision must come to rest. The solar is cold despite the window. The sunlight creeps in like a thief, half-hearted and indifferent. You sit in the high-backed chair, the one that creaks less than the others, and the steward unfurls the scroll. It's longer than expected. They always are. You skim it with the weariness of someone reading their own sentence. You issue a judgment, knowing full well that neither side will be pleased. But they will obey. That is what matters. That is what nobility means. In the end, not wisdom, not justice, just certainty delivered without hesitation. More arrive, a bailiff reporting a shortage of grain, a priest concerned about superstition among the villagers, dancing in the fields, odd symbols carved in doorposts, a midwife summoned to explain why her herbal remedies cost more than the last tithe collected from the mill. Each speaks in turn, never overlapping, never casual. You listen, or rather, you receive. You are a vessel for complaints, for rumours, for truths wrapped in feudal deference. You respond not because you believe, but because you must. To remain silent is to invite interpretation, and interpretation in a castle is a slow poison. By midday your hand aches from sealing wax. Your voice is raw from giving orders that feel more like riddles. You are asked if you would like to break for a meal. You decline. You are not hungry, not in a way food can fix. The steward frowns, notes it down. Someone will mention it at dinner. Someone always does. You stand and walk to the window, which offers a view not of your lands, but of your walls. High, thick, moss-streaked. You built them. Well, not you, but your name. Your inheritance. You stare through the arrow slit and see movement. Men training in the yard. Children running. A bird landing on a crenellated perch. Life, continuing beneath you, around you, without you. You turn back. The chamber is dim again. The scrolls wait. Your presence is needed elsewhere, always elsewhere. You take your cloak from the hook by the door. The fur is worn thin at the collar. You have others, but this one fits you. Or rather, it doesn't pinch as much. You descend the stairs, not as a person, but as a response. You are the answer that walks, the judgment that breathes, and the castle watches you go, stone-eyed and unblinking. Afternoon comes, though the sun never quite makes it past the walls. Light enters the keep like a guilty guest, low, cautious, filtered through clouds and centuries. You spend the remainder of the day in small rooms, at large tables, surrounded by people who talk but rarely speak. More scrolls are opened, more names are read aloud. Those born, those dead, those late on their levies. Each one is marked in ink, but felt in your spine. These aren't people to you anymore. They're patterns, symptoms. You begin to recognise surnames, the way a farmer might recognise clouds. Not as individuals, but as signs of what's coming. When evening arrives, you eat again. You smile again. You nod again. You say goodnight, walk the corridors, past the same flickering torches, the same portraits of ancestors who never actually looked that confident. You return to the chamber. The fire has not been lit. You do not light it. You disrobe with the same hands that signed 4 executions before dusk. You crawl beneath wool that smells faintly of dust and iron. You close your eyes, and for once no dream comes. Just the sound of wind through the arrow slits. Just the creak of beams remembering wars older than your name. Just the breath of the castle, slow and constant, like something waiting, and now, with the present laid to rest, we return to the beginning, not of this day, but of castles themselves. Because to understand why they were built is to understand why they were endured. Castles were not born from vanity, they were born from terror. The earliest stone fortifications in medieval Europe rose in response to chaos. Not the poetic kind, but the kind made of arrows and fire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the continent became a chessboard of power struggles. Land was held not by nations, but by men. And men, left to govern themselves, tend to reach for the sword before the scroll. Lords needed a way to defend what they had. Castles became the answer. Not luxurious homes, but fortified anchors in a world without anchors. The earliest medieval castles were not stone. They were wood, motte and bailey structures. A raised earth mound, or motte, topped with a wooden keep, surrounded by a walled courtyard, the bailey, and the whole thing ringed with ditches and palisades. These went up fast. A determined crew of peasants could raise one in weeks, sometimes less. They weren't built to last. They were built to intimidate, to declare ownership in a language the local population understood. Height, walls, weapons. It was real estate with teeth. But wood burns, and enemies learn. By the 11th and 12th centuries, those who could afford permanence turned to stone. Stone didn't just defend, it endured. A stone castle was a monument to human effort, specifically the effort of other people. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of labourers were required to build one. They were not volunteers. Most were peasants conscripted into service through feudal obligation. Others were tradesmen, masons, blacksmiths, carpenters, who travelled from site to site, their skills passed down by calloused fingers and shouted over wind. The process began with a survey, not the modern kind. There were no blueprints. The lord and his men would walk the land, point at a hill, argue, and mark it with stones or stakes. Proximity to water was essential. So was elevation. A good castle didn't just defend, it loomed. The quarrying of stone could take years. Blocks were cut using chisels, hammers and wedges, hauled on carts pulled by oxen or dragged by ropes. Timber was also essential, not for the walls but for the scaffolding, hoists and supports. Every castle was a forest in disguise. Lime mortar held it all together. To make it, limestone was baked in kilns, crushed and mixed with water. It dried slowly, but once set it turned to something close to permanence. And still, the walls needed maintenance. They shifted, they cracked, they wept in the rain, and those who built them rarely saw them completed. Castles often took decades, sometimes lifetimes. One generation started the tower, the next died defending it. As the walls rose, so too did the castle's identity. It was not merely a place to live. It was a symbol of authority, of domination, of permanence in a world where most things were anything but. The layout itself told a story of hierarchy carved into stone. At the centre stood the keep, the thick-walled heart of the castle, meant to survive the siege even if everything else fell. Surrounding it were the inner and outer baileys, each enclosed by walls of increasing thickness and menace. Towers, round, never square, for better deflection of projectiles, punctuated the perimeter. Each one was both lookout and last resort. There were arrow loops and murder holes, drawbridges and portcullises, every feature engineered with one purpose: delay the inevitable. Every inch of the structure was meant to exhaust the enemy's patience, frustrate their weapons, and absorb time itself. Inside, the spaces reflected the social order that had commissioned them. The great hall stood as a long echoing sermon in timber and stone. It was where the Lord ate, ruled and received, but also where dozens of others slept, laboured and whispered. The private chambers above were small and unheated. The kitchens were cavernous furnaces where bodies sweated from dawn until dusk. The chapel, always present, was a concession to eternity, because even warlords need a place to feel briefly forgiven. Storage rooms were buried deep, and the dungeons deeper still, carved into the rock like afterthoughts no one dared revisit. To walk a finished castle was to move through the embodied paranoia of a ruling class that trusted no one, not even their own walls. But before these spaces could inspire dread, they had to be shaped. Masons cut stone into shapes so precise that some castles still stand today without modern mortar. Scaffoldings groaned with the weight of half-laid battlements, and cranes powered by tread wheels, giant wooden hamster wheels, turned by men, hauled up blocks heavier than most oxen. It was slow, it was dangerous. The death toll is never recorded, because the men who died lifting the walls were never expected to be remembered. Their contribution was measured not in names, but in inches. And always above the noise was the presence of the Lord, watching, directing, sometimes changing his mind halfway through construction. A tower shortened, a wall extended, a gate moved, not because of strategy, but because he saw a rival's castle and wanted his bigger. Castles were monuments to ego as much as engineering, and like all egos, they were never truly finished. Long before the first stone was laid, the land itself had to be broken, coerced into cooperation. Castles did not grow from nothing. They were imposed upon the earth, and the earth resented it. Hills were carved, valleys filled, ditches dug deep and wide enough to trap more than just invaders. Moats were not just decorative, they were labour-intensive scars in the landscape, lined with clay, fed by diverted streams, and constantly managed to avoid stagnation. When they worked, they formed a ring of reflective menace. When they didn't, they became swamps, churning with frogs, filth, and disease. Yet no lord would build without one. A castle without a moat was like a knight without a sword. It lacked the proper silhouette of terror. The earthworks demanded hands, dozens, sometimes hundreds, armed with shovels, spades and baskets. There were no machines. Every mound was man-made, each trench a testament to repetition and soreness. The dirt had to go somewhere, so it formed the base of the motte, the raised platform that lifted the castle from the earth as if in protest. A castle was always above. That was the point. To be visible from every angle, to loom even when doing nothing at all. But soil is fickle, it shifts, it collapses. It remembers rain differently in each season. Walls cracked, foundations sank, builders adjusted, improvised, reinforced. Oak pilings were driven into soft ground. Stones were underpinned with rubble and mortar. Some sites were abandoned mid-build when the earth simply refused to cooperate. Others were finished anyway, only to tilt over decades like tired monuments nodding into the hills. Even after construction ended, the land demanded tending. Embankments eroded, moats needed dredging. Siege damage had to be patched. Winter froze the ground into rock. Summer turned it to dust. A castle was not a building. It was a wound that needed constant stitching. It bled resources. Wood, stone, lime, salt, men, time. And once built, it did not rest. It became hungry. It demanded guards, servants, cooks, masons, falconers, scribes and whores. It needed carts of firewood every day, just to stay warm enough to be survivable. Every castle was an empire in miniature, and like all empires, it came with a price. And yet still they were built, over and over, higher, thicker, sharper, No castle builds itself. Behind every towering keep and encircling curtain wall stands a man, or sometimes a child, or a widow, or a warlord, in all but name, who claimed the land and poured his fears into stone. Castles were not just built by lords, they made lords. In the medieval world, legitimacy was slippery. Titles could be bought, forged, inherited with dubious paperwork, or claimed by force. But a castle was proof. You didn't just say you ruled a territory, you demonstrated it by altering the skyline, by extracting enough labour to raise a tower, by collecting enough stone to fill a chapel, by hiring enough soldiers to stand along the battlements and watch with eyes that did not blink. To build a castle was to shout your presence across the valley. It was a declaration of power in an age when written words held less sway than walls. A manor house might say you had money. A castle said you could keep it. It told every peasant, merchant, traveller and rival noble exactly who held the local monopoly on violence. It was your court, your treasury, your jail and your billboard, all rolled into one grim silhouette, and once built it required maintenance, not just of stone and soil, but of reputation. A crumbling castle was worse than no castle at all. It suggested decline, weakness. It hinted that the lord within might not be able to collect his taxes, or protect his serfs, or defend his claims. The king, if he were feeling generous or strategic, might grant permission to build. Technically, you were supposed to ask. This was known as a license to crenellate. In reality, many castles were built without one. The paperwork, when it existed at all, was often a formality issued after the fact. The walls went up first, the justifications came later, because once the stones were laid and the gates hung, what could the king really do? March an army to tear down your livelihood? Not without considerable cause and risk. Stone had a way of legitimizing itself through sheer stubborn presence. Castles bred dynasties. A family that could hold one for a generation might claim they had always ruled. Children born within its walls inherited more than wealth. They inherited geography. And over time, that geography became memory, stories, lineage, a myth of permanence built from mortar and repetition. But beneath every lineage was the truth, that the first stone was laid by someone who needed to prove he belonged, that every castle was, at heart, a monument to doubt, turned outward. Construction was not a silent endeavour, far from it. If you were to stand beside a rising castle in the 12th century, you would not hear reverence or ceremony. You would hear shouting, swearing, scraping, and the rhythmic thump of labour. Hammers on chisels, chisels on stone, the groan of oxen dragging timber through rutted roads. It was an orchestra of misery and motion, conducted by foremen whose tempers matched the weather, and overseen by lords who visited just often enough to demand something impractical. There were no safety rails, no gloves. Men worked barefoot on ladders that bowed in the wind, carrying baskets of rubble on their backs like condemned mules. Stonecutters shouted in French, in English, in Latin-inflected fragments that passed for orders. Labourers understood only enough to avoid immediate danger. Apprentices moved like shadows, copying the gestures of their elders with wide eyes and blistered palms. Everything was heavy. Every beam, every tool, every breath taken in the shadow of a half-built curtain wall. The mortar smoked when mixed, stung when smeared, burned if left on skin too long. Accidents happened, often, a slip from a scaffold, a dropped stone, a cart overturned on soft spring ground. When someone died, work paused, briefly. A priest mumbled, a grave was dug, the line of men filled back in. There was no shortage of hands. Poverty made sure of that. There were temporary huts built near the site, small encampments of tents, timber shacks, and fires that never quite warmed anyone. Children ran through the mud, wives bartered for salt and bread, and old men mended tools with iron so brittle it flaked like bark. These workers would not live in the castle. They would not even enter it when it was finished. Their names would not be carved, their stories not passed down, but their labour would remain, silent and binding in every seam between stones. And even once the outer shell was done, when the walls stood and the towers loomed and the gatehouse finally hung its doors, work did not stop. The castle had to be dressed, as they said. Finished on the inside, plaster walls, wooden floors, windows glazed if you could afford it, or shuttered if you couldn't. Iron hinges forged to match timber, warped by wind. Water channels dug, latrines chiselled, fireplaces hooded with awkward care. Everything by hand, everything by sweat. Not everyone in a medieval castle was free to leave. Some weren't free to speak. Others weren't even supposed to be seen. And among them, at the very bottom of the human hierarchy, lower than the cook, lower than the stable boy, lower than the pigs who slept indoors during winter, there were the enslaved. Their presence is often erased from polite chronicles, their names left out of household roles, their faces unpainted in tapestries. But they were there, behind the walls, beneath the stairs, carrying the weight of a system that did not acknowledge them beyond their usefulness. Medieval Europe did not operate under one definition of slavery. There were villains, bound to land but not to owners. There were serfs, semi-free in name, taxed in flesh. But there were also thralls in Norse societies, and outright chattel slaves in Mediterranean territories. Men and women captured in wars, raids or debt, sold at markets, inherited like livestock. Castles, especially those along contested frontiers or in trade-rich ports, often kept such people out of sight but within reach. They were janitors of the unspoken, torch-bearers in the night, tendons behind tapestries. Could they escape? In theory, yes. There were no microchips, no handcuffs, just stone, geography, and vigilance. But castles were built to trap. Even those who were free struggled to leave them behind. For the enslaved, escape meant far more than crossing a gate. It meant outrunning dogs, bribing guards, surviving forests filled with wolves and worse. It meant leaving behind a language you might barely know, and wandering into towns where your face would be unfamiliar, your dialect suspect, and your very presence questioned. There were no papers, no protection. To be free was not enough. You had to be invisible too. Yet history whispers of those who tried. Not in epic tales, but in fragments. A stolen key, a ladder left unsecured, a servant who disappeared during a feast and was never found. Rumours half believed of men who fled through latrines, crawling for hours through filth to reach the moat, only to vanish into the woods. Most were caught, some weren't. Their stories, when told, were cautionary. Warnings to others not to dream too loudly. The castle remembered, and it punished forgetfulness. Slavery in a medieval castle did not always look like what the modern mind expects. There were no chains clanking in the dungeons for the sake of spectacle, as we mentioned before. Just quiet commands, silent suffering, and 1,002 ways to remind a person they did not belong to themselves. Often, enslaved individuals were given roles indistinguishable from servants. They scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, tended fires, and fetched water in silence. The difference lay not in the labour, but in the absence of choice. A servant might leave after the harvest. A slave remained when the crops failed, when the lords fled, when the castle burned. Women fared no better, and often far worse. Enslaved women were currency. Their bodies served where coin did not, traded between nobles, given as gifts, alongside horses and goblets. A new bride arriving at a castle might bring 2 maids, one free, who wore livery, one not, who did not speak unless spoken to. In times of siege, these women were left out of rations. In times of peace, they were forgotten entirely. And yet the castle needed them. It relied on their silence, on their presence without acknowledgement. They lit fires before dawn and stirred pots long after the lords retired. They learned the architecture better than the architects. They knew which flagstones squeaked, which hallway echoed too loudly. Where the steward hid the wine he pretended not to drink. This knowledge became its own form of power. Not liberation, not revenge, but leverage. Faint and dangerous, like holding a candle near old parchment. Could they use it to escape? Sometimes. A bribe here, a favour owed there, a guard with a fondness for wine, or a knight distracted by his own indulgence. But escape wasn't just about slipping through the gates. It was surviving the silence that followed. If caught, punishments were often final. Branding, mutilation, death if you were lucky. More often, you were made into an example that bled slowly. A man's feet removed, a woman's tongue, and worse than the punishment was the reinstatement, the cruel return to invisibility. So most did not run, not because they lacked courage, but because the world outside the castle was even worse. There were no laws to protect the escaped, no organisations, no networks, no names written on walls, only villages that feared strangers and forests that swallowed the slow. The castle did not need to shout to enforce obedience. It had other methods, subtler ones, beneath the feasts, the prayers, the torchlit processions. There were rooms no one spoke about directly, only gestured toward with the eyes. Dungeons, not always as dramatic as the word suggests. Not iron-barred cages and rats with speech patterns. Just rooms, cold, low-ceilinged, unlit, forgotten by everyone except the punished and those who placed them there. Some were carved directly into bedrock, the walls unfinished, damp with the seepage of time. Others were once wine cellars, then repurposed when discipline became more important than drink. There were no uniform plans. One castle's dungeon was a hallway with barred alcoves. Another's was a single pit beneath a trapdoor. You could walk across it for years and never know it was there, until someone opened the panel and lowered a rope. Punishment in a castle didn't need spectacle. Most people knew the rules, all learned quickly, but when someone forgot their place, the dungeon waited. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a winter. The door would close, and that was that. No trial, unless the Lord was feeling philosophical. No defence, just stone, and the knowledge that above you, life continued uninterrupted. Fires were stoked, wine was poured. Your name faded from casual use. That was the most effective part of it. Not the dark, not the chill, but the irrelevance. Some dungeons weren't even cells, just oubliettes, named from the French oublier, to forget. No door, no hallway, just a vertical shaft, too narrow to climb, too deep to jump. A person could be lowered in, a tray passed down with water and crusts, then silence. They weren't meant to die, they were meant to disappear. And disappear they did. The dungeon was never the largest room in the castle, but it was often the most carefully designed. Not for comfort, not even for restraint, but for absence. The absence of light, of sound, of context. Its stones were colder, smoother, less forgiving. Its air smelled not of rot, though rot was present, but of time sealed off from the rest of the world. There were no windows, only slits to let in air so stale it barely moved. No candles, unless permitted. No straw unless someone remembered. Most didn't. The silence was not complete. That was the trick. A complete silence might allow the prisoner to believe they had slipped from the world entirely, but the dungeon gave you just enough to remind you that the world continued without you. A faint footstep above, a bell tolling somewhere deep in the keep, a murmur of voices that would not come near. It was isolation, not emptiness. The worst part wasn't being alone. It was being adjacent to life and hearing it choose not to acknowledge you. Some cells had rings set into the floor for chains. Others did not bother. The walls themselves were punishment enough. Sloped inward, moist, eternally damp, mice visited, not rats, not usually. Rats had better sense than to linger. The food, when it came, arrived in chipped bowls without explanation. Bread, mostly, sometimes nothing. You could measure your sentence by how often they forgot you. A man once emerged after a week with no idea who ruled the realm. A woman once emerged after 3 days, her hair white and eyes unblinking. And no one asked what she'd seen. No one wanted to know. Not all who entered the dungeon were prisoners in the legal sense. Sometimes they were reminders, a cousin too loud at court, a servant who overheard the wrong name, a guest who asked a question no one wanted to answer. The castle didn't execute them. That would make martyrs. It merely placed them in the quiet and waited, and in time, even their memory grew still. Because the castle did not need to shout, it whispered. And the dungeon, its deepest whisper, said only this: you are no longer part of the story. Not everything that moved within the castle walked on 2 legs. Animals lived there too, some welcome, others tolerated, and a few simply never asked permission. The noble households, for all their formality and stone, were filled with creatures. Noble falcons perched on gauntlets, lapdogs tucked beneath heavy skirts, cats curling beneath banquet tables, horses clattering through courtyards, and pigs, yes pigs, waddling through kitchens with a sense of purpose that bordered on impudence. Pets, as we imagine them now, were not common. To be kept simply for affection was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. And even then, affection was often conditional. Dogs were favoured in court. Small ones, often with curled tails and wide, startled eyes, were carried like accessories, their names embroidered on collars, their meals better than most servants. They sat on laps during councils, whimpered during sermons, and slept on beds stuffed with feathered linen, while human guests were given rushes. Some were even buried with honours, wrapped in linen, their graves marked with little stones that bore no names, just the memory of who had loved them. Larger dogs served more practical roles. Mastiffs and hounds guarded gates and accompanied hunts, their growls more effective than most guards. Horses, though kept in stables, were among the most prized possessions of the nobility. A well-bred destrier was worth more than a field of peasants. They were fed carefully, brushed daily, shod with iron, and mourned with more public grief than some children. Yet for all their status, horses knew nothing of their importance. They rolled in mud, they bit when impatient, they chewed on banners, and once famously defecated during a coronation. Cats, on the other hand, lived as they pleased. They were rarely named, they were fed sometimes, but they earned their keep by hunting mice in the grain stores, rats in the cellars, and the occasional bat in the rafters. They were tolerated, even respected, but never trusted. In some castles, especially later in the Middle Ages, cats were associated with witchcraft. In others, they were just part of the landscape, like moss on the outer wall, or a draught near the east stair. Always present, never explained. And then there were the others, the animals no one invited, sparrows nesting in the arrow loops, stoats that slipped through kitchens like thieves, foxes that crept into courtyards by night and were gone by morning, leaving nothing but feathers. And rats, of course. Rats were not pets. They were roommates, persistent, multiplying, watching. They lived beneath floors, behind tapestries, inside barrels. The castle never got rid of them. It simply pretended not to see. These animals knew the castle as well as any steward. They moved through it without invitation, without hesitation, and with the quiet understanding that they belonged, not by title, not by blood, but by endurance, just like everyone else. If you woke early enough, before the servants stirred and the kitchens clattered to life, you could sometimes hear them, the animals, before the castle itself began its performance. The slow snort of a horse shifting in its stall, the cluck of hens tucked beneath eaves, the restless flutter of pigeons roosting in the tower slits. A fox, if it was brave or hungry, might pace the outer yard in a silence sharper than any blade, and high above, falcons cried from the mews, hooded and chained, waiting for the hand that would take them skyward. Falconry was not a pastime, it was a status symbol, so entrenched that entire treaties were written about who could own which bird. A commoner might carry a kestrel, a baron a hawk, a king, always a king, a gerfalcon, white and fierce and worth its weight in silver. The birds lived better than most squires, fed on meat, cleaned daily, trained patiently with leather gloves and whistles. They did not know their power. They did not need to. It was worn by the man who carried them, like a living coat of arms. Peacocks sometimes strutted through the outer courts, not because they were useful, but because they reminded guests that wealth was a matter of feathers and waste. They screamed at odd hours and terrified younger children. Monkeys, too, were kept by the very rich, brought from far-off ports by sailors with missing fingers, and stories that unravelled under scrutiny. The monkeys bit. They stole. They smeared filth where filth had already long since claimed dominion. But their presence meant something. That the Lord could afford not only chaos, but exotic chaos. Even the livestock bore witness. Pigs squealed in the refuse heaps, rooting through a castle's layers of discarded pride. Goats stood on ledges they had no business reaching. Chickens roamed with impunity, sometimes laying eggs in helmets left carelessly near the armoury. Cows provided milk, but also warmth, sleeping inside during winter, snoring beside the hearth, their breath misting in the frozen air like displaced spirits. And yet, for all this closeness, for all the mingling of claw and hoof and paw and hand, there were still lines that could not be crossed. Dogs were allowed in the hall, but not at the table. Cats were allowed in the grain rooms, but not in the chapel. Horses had names, but never the Lord's name. Animals were tolerated because they were useful, or beautiful, or amusing. Never because they were equal. Though truth be told, the animals lived closer to the truth of the castle than any noble did. They did not pretend, they did not feign power, they simply endured, quietly, stubbornly, tooth against stone, claw against wood, feather against wind, watching, waiting, outlasting. Castles were built for war, but most of the time, they simply waited for it. Their walls were declarations of preparedness, not guarantees of action. A siege might come once in a generation, or never. And yet the threat of violence haunted every corridor like smoke after a fire. Castles were armed to the teeth, towers for archers, murder holes above the gates. Boiling oil, imagined even when none was present. But war, when it finally arrived, rarely looked the way legends promised. Yes, there were fights. Yes, there were sieges. But most battles happened outside the castle walls, in fields, forests, and river crossings. The castle itself was the prize, not the arena. When war came to a castle, it came slowly, first with riders spotted on the horizon, then with smoke from a nearby village, then with messengers, out of breath, out of news, and then silence, the kind that presses down on the lungs, the kind that tells you the enemy has arrived. Siege warfare was not quick. It was not dramatic, it was cold, muddy and relentless. Attackers would surround the castle, cut off its food, its water, its firewood. They built trebuchets to hurl stones at the walls, or worse, dead animals burning tar, disease itself. Defenders waited. They fired arrows from towers. They rang bells not to call to God, but to tell the besiegers they still had the strength to ring them. They boiled oil, if they had it, poured it from murder holes onto heads they couldn't see. If oil was scarce, and it often was, they used water, heated until it hissed like judgment, or they dropped rocks, not shaped for throwing, just heavy and inevitable. And above all, they waited. That was the soul of a siege, waiting, on both sides. The attackers watched for weakness, the defenders watched for hope. Days passed into weeks, weeks passed into the peculiar numbness of hunger. Inside the castle, the food dwindled. Salted pork turned grey, bread hardened to stone. Rats, once pests, became meat. Pigeons vanished from rooftops, not in flight, but in stew. Even dogs, once curled beneath noble feet, began to look less like companions and more like calories. Servants starved first, children next, nobles last. But hunger was democratic in its cruelty. It slowed thoughts, it blurred vision, it softened the knees of men who had once stood for hours in iron armour. Soon sentries collapsed on their posts, not from wounds, but from emptiness. Disease came next, always. Dysentery mostly, not romantic, not gallant, just a slow rot of the gut, passed from bucket to hand to mouth. The well, if there was one, ran low. The moat, if it hadn't dried, grew still and poisonous. Bodies piled, not from battle, but from waiting. The smell turned sweet, then sour, then it simply became the air. And still, the walls held, or didn't. Because sometimes, the enemy built towers of their own, belfries, dragged on wheels, and covered in wet hides to deflect fire. These rose like trees against the stone, filled with men who climbed and jumped and died by the dozen. Sometimes they dug, mines burrowed beneath the walls, packed with timber, then set ablaze. The ground itself betrayed the defenders, crumbling under towers that had stood for generations. If the gate fell, it was not a glorious moment. It was a collapse. Wood splintered, iron screamed, fire entered, and it did not ask who had prayed. Rooms filled with smoke. Women fled to chapels. Men fled nowhere. They were needed. They died. Sometimes well, more often not. And when the attackers breached the walls, they brought no mercy. The rules of war said a castle that resisted siege could expect no quarter, not for its lord, not for its livestock, not for the boy who swept rushes or the woman who milked goats. What could not be carried was burned. What could not be used was broken. And those who lived had only one task to remember. When it was over, if there was an over, it did not end with trumpets or treaties. There was no parade, no sudden restoration of order. There was only smoke and silence, the kind of silence that settles over a place like dust, clinging to every crevice. The attackers left if they had taken what they came for, or they stayed if they wanted more. A new banner might fly from the battlements, limp in the wind, its colours unfamiliar to the survivors below, but the stone did not care. It had worn other colours. it would wear these too. The castle itself stood, or mostly did. Walls cracked, towers blackened, roofs scorched and fallen. The great hall might have become a stable, the chapel a storeroom. The private chambers, if not pillaged, were stripped of names, the tapestries cut down for warmth, furniture dragged into the courtyard and broken for kindling. What remained was not a home, it was a husk, a monument to what happens when fear and ambition collide, and one runs out of bread before the other runs out of arrows. The people rebuilt or tried. Survivors moved quietly, like ghosts unsure of their welcome. The steward, if he survived, began to count the dead, not to mourn them, but to adjust the ledgers. The smith hammered iron again, though he limped now. The kitchen boiled water, though not for food, just to clean what could be cleaned. And children, too young to know silence was not the natural sound of stone, played in the rubble with sticks, their games eerily accurate in their imitation of death. Sometimes a noble returned, a cousin, a widow, a boy with too much name and not enough age. They arrived with a few guards and a speech written in someone else's hand. They promised to restore the walls, to protect, to rebuild, to rule better this time. The servants bowed, the farmers nodded, and the castle, which had seen such declarations before, remained unimpressed. Because once a siege had come, the castle was never the same. Its stone was older, its air heavier. There were rooms no one used anymore, and a smell that never quite left. And at night, when the fires burned low, and the wind passed through arrow slits like memory itself, you could swear the walls still echoed, not with voices, but with hunger, with waiting, with the knowledge that in time it would all happen again. Today the castles that once rang with bells, moaned beneath siege, and housed the weight of 100,000 quiet tragedies, are mostly silent. Some remain whole, preserved by the accident of geography or the affection of a nation. Others stand in ruin, broken teeth against the skyline, their towers hollow, their gates rusted open to wind and weeds. But even in ruin, they persist. They are not dead. They are dormant, waiting as they always have. Across Europe alone, more than 10,000 castles are known to have existed. Some lists stretch into the tens of thousands if you count every fortified manor, every hilltop watchtower, every motte and bailey reduced now to a line of earth and a plaque. In England, over 4,000 sites are registered. Germany claims nearly 25,000 castle ruins and preserved fortresses. France boasts thousands as well, from the dramatic spires of the Loire Valley to the crumbling keeps of Normandy. Some are museums now, others are hotels, their dungeons converted to spas, their halls adorned with modern plumbing and ironic signage. But many, most even, are abandoned. They crumble on cliffs, half swallowed by ivy and silence. You might stumble upon one by accident. A bend in a road reveals a tower you didn't expect. No sign, no guardrail, just moss-covered stone and a hint of memory in the air. The steps still rise, if you're brave. The wind still howls through the arrow slits, and if you press your hand to the wall, you'll feel not just cold, but history. These are the bones of giants, not men but structures. They outlasted lords, kings, borders, languages. They watched plagues pass like shadows. They stood through gunpowder, through reformations, through the invention of flight and the silent arrival of satellites overhead. They do not resent being obsolete. They are above resentment. They are ruins. And they are more honest now than they ever were at their height. Some castles have become destinations, not just for the curious, but for the devout. Pilgrims of the past, tourists with cameras instead of swords, Walk the same corridors once tread by knights, kings, cooks and lice. In places like Edinburgh, Carcassonne, Neuschwanstein and Windsor, the castles are clean now, scrubbed, restored, curated. The walls are patched, the halls repainted. There are fire exits and gift shops. The smell of damp straw has been replaced by the faint sweetness of merchandise and medieval-themed chocolate bars. You can buy a replica sword for your child. You can dine in the Great Hall, now with menu options and vegetarian sides. Guides walk you through it all. They point to the arrow slits, the murder holes, the place where the drawbridge once groaned. They do not mention the dysentery. They do not linger on the fact that the Lord's private chamber also doubled as a birthing room, a strategy room, a prison. The dungeon, if it is mentioned at all, is clean, sterilised, sometimes lit in dramatic blue for effect. The rats have been replaced by plastic models. The oubliette is roped off for safety. And still, something remains, even in the most commercialised castles, even with the crowds, the noise, the laughter of children wearing plastic crowns. You can feel it. A chill in the stairwell, the shift of light across the battlements, a breeze that doesn't match the season. The walls remember, no matter how many posters you hang, no matter how many interpretive plaques you mount in brass. The stone holds its silence. You walk past a doorway and feel for a moment the presence of someone behind it, someone not listed in the tour, someone who never left. And then there are the quiet ones, the castles without brochures, without tour groups, without car parks or directional arrows, the ones that aren't listed on websites or tucked into guidebooks with glossy covers. They stand in fields, on ridgelines, at the edge of old forests where the trees lean just slightly too close, roofless, hollowed, half swallowed by ivy, by moss, by time. Sheep graze at their base, teenagers spray initials into the mortar. Locals avoid them after dark, not from superstition, they say, but from habit. These castles do not invite, they endure. Their stone is darker, worn not just by wind but by indifference. Their gates are rusted, fallen inward like mouths too tired to speak. The stairs are treacherous, the towers cracked, and yet they remain, not polished, not preserved, but true. You walk through an arch with no door, and suddenly you are inside history, not as visitor, but as witness. The sun slips behind a cloud, and for a moment you feel the cold as it truly was. Not theatrical, not metaphorical, just the physical chill of life lived in stone. There is no velvet rope around the well, no sign to explain the soot-stained chimney. You step carefully, not because someone told you to, but because the castle itself suggests it. Every fallen stone is a sentence cut short, every hollow window an eye that forgot how to blink. The birds nest in the keep now. The bees hum through arrow slits that once whistled with returning shafts. And the silence, when it comes, is not empty. It is full of memory. The sound of hooves over drawbridges, long rotted. The slap of wet leather in a guard room. The hiss of old fire, dying without notice. The creak of a wooden table pulled back into place. Footsteps, yours, on a floor once swept by hands now dust. You are not alone, not entirely. These ruins remember, not what they were, but what they held. Hunger, heat, laughter, blood, names spoken once and never again. They do not need to speak, they have already said enough. If the castle was a fortress pretending to be a home, the prison was a truth without pretense. No banners, no ballads, just walls, thicker, colder, more honest in their purpose. Where a castle might ring with feasts and sermons, the prison rang only with footsteps, groans, keys. The iron sang as it turned, not for celebration, for closure. Medieval prisons did not separate the guilty from the innocent. They separated the fortunate from the forgotten. You were thrown in for theft, for owing taxes, for asking the wrong question of the wrong person on the wrong day. Trials came later, or not at all. You were kept not for justice, but for waiting. Waiting to confess, waiting to die, waiting for someone to remember you. Often they didn't. The cells were not uniform. Some were large, barn-like rooms packed shoulder to shoulder, the stink of 50 men rotting the straw beneath them. Others were pits, literal holes, round and slick, with no bed, no light, no plan. Water seeped in through the stone. Rats fell in and could not climb back out. Neither could you. There were no schedules, no meals as such. Someone might bring bread, might bring water, might forget. The darkness had no hour. Time became a rumour, measured only by the swelling of sores, the growing of beards, the fading of names in your mind. You forgot what your sister looked like. Then you forgot her name. Then you forgot your own. Some prisons were inside castles. Others were beneath churches. Some were entire buildings devoted to the practice of unpersoning. The Tower of London, the Bastille, Castel Sant'Angelo, they had dungeons, yes, but also offices, scribes, torturers with contracts. There was administration, records, filing. The machinery of forgetting operated in triplicate. Women too were held, not for crime, for scandal, for convenience, for birth. A lady whose husband died too soon, a nun who refused, a midwife whose poultices healed without permission. Their cells were cleaner sometimes, the walls whitewashed, the windows latticed, but the silence was the same, perhaps louder, and yet the prisons remained. When kings fell, they stayed. When flags changed, the keys did not, because every state, every realm, every reforming dynasty needed somewhere to put the inconvenient. The stone did not care what language the orders were written in. It closed the door with the same sound. And when people were finally let out, if they were, they did not return whole. They blinked against sunlight, as if it were punishment. They walked slowly. They talked to no one. They did not speak of the inside, not because they were afraid, but because they knew. The prison was still there. Even if the doors were open, even if the walls were crumbling, it lived inside them now. In time, the stone prison gave way to something more polished. The Enlightenment brought theories, blueprints, reformers with ideas about penitence and architecture. The prison, once a chaotic whole, became a building shaped like a diagram, symmetrical, rational, unforgiving in its clarity. The panopticon, the radial prison, the cell block. These were castles in reverse. No feasts, no chapels with stained glass. Just corridors, endless identical corridors. The cell doors closed with precision now. The guards wore uniforms. The silence was engineered, and yet nothing changed. The men inside still waited, still sat, still listened to time pass like water under a locked grate. The windows, if there were any, were narrow, high, and out of reach. The food arrived without ceremony. The light turned off without warning. The new prisons bragged of hygiene, of order, of moral correction. But the souls inside festered just the same. You could walk 100 yards and not hear a voice. You could scream and find that your voice returned only to you. Solitary confinement was the triumph of modern prison design. A room with no other presence, just walls and the sound of your own breath. It was considered humane at first, clean, controlled. They called it the silent system. Men emerged after weeks unable to remember how to speak without whispering. Eyes blinked like creatures kept too long in root cellars. Time in solitary did not move forward. It settled, it pulled in the corners like old air. Even now in the modern world, with courtrooms and appeals and civil rights, prisons remain. Still stone, still steel, still shaped by the need to contain what society does not wish to see. They are filled with the poor, the sick, the misused, the unlucky, the inconvenient. Their walls are painted now, their lights electric, but the corridor has not changed. You walk it in your dreams, even if you've never entered one in life. A hallway without end, doors without names, footsteps that do not echo. You feel watched, even alone. You reach the end of the hall, only to find another. Because prisons, like castles, are not just buildings. They are patterns, carved into policy, burned into memory, passed down in silence. And in the quiet moments, when the world is asleep and the night stretches long and featureless, you may find yourself there, not in body, but in thought, in breath, in the knowledge that somewhere a door has just closed and someone on the other side is still waiting. Thank you for walking the cold corridors of history with me tonight. You've climbed the stairs of forgotten towers, eaten from trenches hardened like shields, and slept uneasily beneath ceilings that groan with memory. Now the fires in the hearth have died down, the walls grow still, the banners sag in the windless dark, and the castle, never truly asleep, closes its eyes just long enough for you to rest. Sleep well, watcher of ruins, until the next gate creaks open